Welcome to Concerning the Spiritual in Art, a podcast exploring spirituality, consciousness, and the creative process. I'm your host, Martin Benson. All right, y'all, welcome back to the podcast. Today I have Emily Weiner on, and man, we had just an incredible conversation around her really fascinating work that she does. We talk about the archetypes of the collective unconscious, Carl Jung. We talked about Joseph Campbell, the relationship between this sort of universal archetypical space and painting, and how painting really serves as an opportunity for us to share these symbolic expressions of what can sometimes be really hard to talk about. We talk a lot about her own process for how she makes her work, like how does she begin her paintings, the way that she creates her beautiful ceramic frames and the purpose behind those. Our conversation just went to a lot of incredible spaces related to the painting process, the relationship between sort of like spiritual identity and our identities as artists. And so I think you all are going to really love this conversation. So here you go, Emily Weiner. Hey, y'all, I'm going to cut in here real quick for all my YouTube viewers out there, just to remind you that the podcast also exists on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and any major podcast platform. So if you're enjoying what you're seeing here on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe on one of those platforms as well, so you can take the show with you on the go and never really miss an episode. Also, I wanted to let you know that I'm now offering subscriptions on my Instagram page at Martin L. Benson for 99 cents a month. That's less than $12 a year, which that funding will go toward helping produce the show. So I can continue to evolve the podcast, continue to create great content. So if you support what I'm doing here and are enjoying all this content here on YouTube, consider not only subscribing on the podcast platforms, but also subscribing on Instagram for that 99 cents a month so that I can continue on this path. So thank you all. Now back to the show. Peace. All right, Emily Weiner, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, I'm super excited to connect with you. We were just kind of talking off camera a little bit about you being from Nashville and sort of the art scene that's there, and me coming across your work through Red Arrow Gallery and the show that you've done there and the work that you've kind of displayed in their group shows over the years. And it's just, I've been drawn into your work, especially like the archetypical components and the way you use symbols, but also like your color palettes, your compositions, even like the way that you build your frames. Like I just love like the ceramic frames, like just the way
Thank
you're
you.
thinking about the complete object of the artwork. And so there's so many ways we can like enter this
Yes.
conversation, but I think the most interesting for me would be to like learn about the origins of your own personal interest in like archetypal symbols and sort of like thinking about like Jungian psychology, mythology, like where did this kind of begin for you personally? And like, how did you start to incorporate it into your practice as an artist?
I mean, it's such a big question
I
because
know.
for me, it's like, it's so organic. There was never
Mm-hmm.
a time when I was like, this is what I want to paint. And it just, I could funnel it all in. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of the opposite. Like this was a point that I felt like could encompass so much, because with my work, there was always so much going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to realize pretty early on, when I was in graduate school, I was making a lot of work where I was painting from photographs, but I was also kind of learning how to paint and use color in a way that was more skillful. And so I was kind of just painting to paint. And what I
Mm-hmm.
started to see come up were these repetitions of when I didn't really know much about Carl Jung yet. Like when I was in college, I definitely knew Freud, and my parents come from like backgrounds of social work and psychiatrics.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew something was happening, right? I was like,
Mm-hmm.
why does this circle keep appearing in all of these
Mm-hmm.
paintings? And it might come through in a different way. Like it's a moon here, and it's like an Ouroboros here, and it's like so. I think when I found out about Carl Jung, I kind of I was like, this is language for what I've already been doing.
Yeah.
This idea of the
Hmm.
archetype, or the
Yep.
idea of like kind of a more structured framework for
Mm.
symbolism and how it is a universal language through
Yeah.
generations and cultures and time.
Yes.
Because I was never very interested in making work that was autobiographical,
Yeah.
which I think is kind of a hard sell when you're in graduate school because they want to know like about you and does this come from something very personal. And for me, it was like, this is all very personal information to me because it's an exploration into where I came from or the origins
Yes.
of like,
Yes.
how does this psychology work that has been given to me but was never explained to me? I'm just kind of
Hmm.
wading through the cosmic, you know, mush and just trying to put it into paint and figure out what it all means. It's like kind of
Yeah.
personal psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if that's even an answer, it's like that is
No, that's an
where it comes
incredible.
from. It's just it's kind of like I couldn't afford psychoanalysis, so I was doing it myself through my painting. Like, what the hell am I talking about here?
Yeah, no, I
And
think you're tapping into something super interesting. There is something kind of universal that's sort of underpinning our reality that we can sort of tap into that's deeply connected to the personal. Like we think about like subjective versus objective truths and things like that. And I think it's a more of like a tapestry that's woven together, and there are components we have to uncover, not just necessarily through our own personal story in this lifetime, but the story of consciousness and animated
yeah,
reality itself. And I think you're right, like Carl Jung and the work he did in terms of explorations of like the collective unconscious and
mhm,
pointing to this sort of universal space where we sort of tap into to derive our mythologies and our symbolisms of understanding of the mystery of our
mhm,
reality. And cultures have been doing that across time. Are
yeah,
you are you familiar with Joseph Campbell and like
absolutely,
his
yes.
work,
Yeah, so that was like the beginning of it, actually.
Mhm.
So, I mean, now it's funny because I have my background is really in painting, art history, and when I was it was just after graduate school, I met my husband, who's now my husband,
Mhm.
and he's from Tennessee. That's why we're here now, but he has such a different background from me. Um, he grew up, I was born in New York City and then raised in New Jersey and then had 20 years in New York from college.
Mhm.
So my background was, my dad is Jewish, my mother is like German Presbyterian. So I came from this very, maybe like a culturally Jewish family without
Mhm.
a lot of religion.
Yeah.
He came from a Southern Baptist family that were very devout.
Wow.
And he wound up going through, when he went to college, he studied religion to try to unpack everything he was given, and then did a graduate studies in theology.
Oh
So
wow.
he kind of had, when I met him, he had all of this like scholarly information, or even just like a introduction to some research that had been done on in these kind of worlds and ideas that I was maybe already exploring in my work.
Yeah. Wow.
So that was one of the first things that I read when I met him. He was like, "You need to read this, the Bill Moyers interview,
Yes. Oh yeah. Bill
Power of
Myers.
Myth, and Hero with a Thousand Faces," because um, this repetition through cultures was so kind of fascinating. It was already happening in my work. I was pulling
Yeah.
ancient Greek imagery and just like some like Tibetan imagery and
Hmm.
from everywhere in all of these and very contemporary kind of uh, images and objects. So it kind of started there, and then from there, like Carl Jung was the obvious kind of the next
Yeah.
tour.
Definitely.
um, yeah,
No.
and then I think it became really part of when I was like, so now I kind of talk about my work, and you always have to say like, okay, so I'm like, I make work through it has a Jungian psychology through a feminist lens. Like, I kind of have to say that like Carl Jung is part of my artist story.
Yeah.
But I think it really did become part of the way that I think because when we moved here, I got a job at Vanderbilt University as a curator.
Oh,
They
cool.
they have a very great collection, which started out as like a teaching collection, but they have ancient Greek and Roman artifacts. They have
Nice.
Renaissance paintings. They have contemporary art. They have, like an amazing John Chamberlain,
Oh,
Rauschenberg's. They have like a mini museum collection.
yeah. Oh, I bet.
And so I put together a show there, and the first show I put together, I just wanted to showcase like the breadth of this work, and I called it Symbols and Archetypes. And
Mm.
so it was this one, the only way I could think of where all of these pieces could sit in one place, and
Yeah.
they were like, uh, wooden pieces from Africa, and, objects from like folk objects from the South. And
Mm.
it was a really cool moment. And I actually got in touch with my husband's former professor he taught a class on Carl Jung
Wow.
at Vanderbilt, and he had just retired. So he came in and he kind of did almost like a mini course, a deep dive into Carl Jung with me. Um, and so that was really validating in a way where I was like,
Yeah.
okay, I don't have the scholarly background. I'm an artist. I'm not like a Carl Jung expert. I says like, I'm qualified to do this and talk about art in this way, then I can own it a little bit. So
Yeah.
I don't claim to be an expert. I just think that Jung is so inviting, and it's
Yes.
kind of like you don't have to. Yeah, it's the opposite of exclusivity.
Yes. It's so interesting too. Like I think about like the history of like Carl Jung, like being an understudy of Freud and like the split that they had, like Freud really being focused more on like psychosexual relationships of like
Libido.
childhood and development. And Jung just really went out deep into the mysticism. Like in my feeling, is a mystic. Have you ever read the Red Book? Are you familiar with the
Absolutely.
Red Book? I
Yes.
mean, it's just unbelievable when you look through his own personal explorations of his own unconscious and like the archetypes of his own spiritual journey and
Yeah.
thinking about art itself, like all the paintings he did in there, the calligraphy. It's unreal. Like anyone out there, if you don't know what the Red Book is, definitely check it out
Absolutely.
because it is like such a fascinating sort of work of art, really.
Yeah,
That
I
I,
mean, what I found to be, I feel like there are some parallels between like, the our culture kind of rediscovering Hilma af Klint, the
mm-hmm.
Carl Jung's Red Book, how this was a piece that he had worked on for so many years of his life, into the like latest years of his life, and nobody saw it. He
I
was
know.
working on this in kind of in secret, and he's known as this, Swiss psychologist, but he was an artist. I mean, that those paintings are wild.
Yeah, some of them
And
are
he was doing
amazing.
this like, dream work on himself, and then illustrating it and writing in this like almost like, illuminated manuscript calligraphy.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like the time he put into this, it was almost like what was his real work, was this
Yeah.
I guess he was both, it really informed what he was doing.
Yeah. I feel like he bridges a gap between like in a way like Eastern mystical aspects, and Western sort of mysticism. Like he
Yes.
really bridges this gap of East and West in like a very subtle way. And especially in relation to this space of like, again, the collective unconscious, like this space from which we're all pulling from to express ourselves, to sort of like try to uncode or decode our like own personal stories and
Yes.
things of that nature. And the fact that like we see such like referring to Joseph Campbell's work, we see such incredible through lines of cultures across time in places where, as far as we know, had no contact with each other, but they're
Mm-mm.
all telling very similar stories. They're all using very similar symbols. And so I think what you're doing in your own artwork is you're tapping into that space in your own personal way. It's like you're bridging, you're taking a subjective lens to an objective space. Because at the end of the
Mm-hmm.
day, like you have your own sort of life experiences, your own personal philosophies, your own interests and gravitations that are being filtered, that are filtering this universal space. And when I look at your work, I feel like it's such a beautiful balance of the objective and subjective
Yeah.
components of sort of the unconscious reality that we occupy. Like we don't recognize how much is going on beneath the surface of our own thoughts. and
I
sort
think
of why
that's
we make choices that we make, like why we're drawn to certain things and why we're repelled by other things. And so I
exactly.
think there's something really authentic happening with the work that you're doing, because you use it in like this a very subtle way sometimes, and sometimes it's pretty direct. Like for example, like looking at the Nautilus, like behind, like even just like thinking about like sacred geometry or like certain forms that we see, permeating all of the natural world. We can
Mhm.
borrow from those because I think in a way they're pointing to this universal space of complete interdependence. And I think
Yes.
we've forgotten that in a lot of
Yes.
ways.
I
You
mean,
know,
I think what you were saying about bridging East and West, these reactions to archetypal mythology, archetypal symbolism come from like a very primordial place, like
mm-hmm.
somewhere in our brains, not even in our brains, but the way that our brains have evolved to be structured to process information. There's no way that you could separate the world, like the symbols in our worlds, the structures in our worlds, through deep time with the way that our brains are
Mm-hmm.
structured. So,
Yeah.
this way, like I really thank you for saying that, because I feel like I'm having my own moment of like analysis. Like I think that subtlety is something that only comes through when you can shut off like a part of your logical brain, all the things
Mm-hmm.
we can kind of learned in this lifetime through our
Yeah.
own contemporary language or personal experiences. And like painting is one of those ways. Like I've heard music is a way too, where you kind of lose the language component and
Yep.
there's something more subtle that can come up a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
definitely.
yeah, for me, I kind of have to trick myself into starting a painting. And
How do you
yeah,
do that?
well, like, okay, so, I'll just paint a gradient, for
Mm-hmm.
example. Today I have like a lot of blank canvases because a lot of work just went out, and I don't know what these new paintings are going to look like.
Mm.
But I will start on a painting because I'll just start with color.
Yep.
And when I'm making these gradients, you can get into a space where you can kind of turn off the language a little bit. And
Yes.
then you'll get a kind of sense of what to do next with the
Mm-hmm.
painting just based on whatever you're seeing. So maybe
Yes,
there's part of that where you can get yourself into like a different language, which is a little bit more
definitely.
universal, um, like a space of, I don't know, openness where
Yes.
it's surprised. I mean, it could fail often, but
And that's good that you fail sometimes. That
yeah, of
means you're
course.
pushing. That means you're exploring. But I know exactly like kind of what you're trying to like illustrate, because it is sort of like hard to speak to, because I think this is beyond language,
Mhm.
in terms of like how we process visual information that's rooted in the evolutionary biology of our own sort of processing of space, thinking about like survival and safety, what we're drawn to, what gives us a sense of safety versus a sense of like trepidation or danger.
Mhm.
There's so many things that happen in the way that we process information, and it happens so fast underneath the
Mhm.
surface of what we're conscious of. And I think when you get into that space of painting, where you're kind of more focused on like the process, like beginning with the color, beginning with those gradients, and all of a sudden you're just in, like you said, like the space of openness, where something will come through you and be like, this goes, you need to put a circle right here. Or like, I see like these curtains, flowing and obscuring the edges of this painting, like
Mhm.
things. And then those motifs, like as you continue to grow, you can recycle them. Be like,
Mhm.
I'm going to try the curtains again, and then let's see what else comes up, how
Yeah,
else we can pull new imagery into it while still maintaining consistency in terms of your own sort of body of work and the imagery
totally.
you're doing. But I get that feeling a lot especially when I'm drawing. I feel like for me, drawing or like using watercolor and ink, because I guess when you're dealing with oil painting, sometimes they can be so precious that like sometimes I feel, and this is
Mhm.
my own like journey that I need to grow through, is like I feel like I need to like control a lot more. I need
Mhm.
to like have a clue more. But like when I'm drawing or I'm using watercolor ink, like I can be more intuitive and like trust that process and let images arise on their own. And
Yeah.
then generally I'll take those and then make them into a larger painting. But
Yeah.
it's something magical that happens when you get in the space where you let go of like the rational, logical framework that you're used to operating within, and you really step into that intuitive, open sort of space to allow, the universal energy of
Mhm.
mystery to flow through you. Like we can give it
Absolutely.
so many names. We can call it the
Yeah.
muses. We
Or
can,
it could be like the banality. Like
yeah,
my best ideas, or not best ideas, but my weird ideas come through
yeah.
when I'm like taking a shower, taking a walk, like
Hmm.
driving, to drop off my kid.
Yep.
When you're not thinking about what you're supposed to do, that's when you get it's almost like a little
Yeah.
tap. You're like, oh, yeah, like the weirdest, when I was like really trusting this process for the first time was when I had my first show with Red Arrow, and I had a few paintings that were paintings of a clown, like a Pierrot character, but
Mm.
also it was kind of scary to me to be painting a clown because I did not know where these images were coming from.
Yeah. Hmm.
I felt so compelled to paint these, and also like the image of the white rabbit
Hmm.
or the image of a dove, like these
Yep.
kind of images that were about like theater, magic, illusion. And I kind of kept going with it. But in this way, like I was starting to think it took a while. It's kind of like when you're in analysis, that I've never been in it, but this is
Yeah.
my analysis. Like, started to realize that these were like stand-ins for myself.
Mm.
I had been, I had this job, it was a brand new mother, moved to a different city, at a job where it was, in theory, such a good learning environment and a good position, but I was really not a good fit, with
Mm.
the culture, and I started to see myself as like a performer,
Mm.
somebody who was kind of showing up and doing this like magic act where I was putting on these shows, and I'd be like wheeling out objects to classrooms and like showing these like freak objects, and I was kind of like, I'm not even the magician here. I'm like the magician's assistant,
Oh, wow.
or I'm this like
Yeah.
clown where it's like, and it was so it was kind of scary to say that because these symbols are so cliche a bit, but
Hmm.
they were powerful for me, and it kind of was a way that my own work can tell me like, hey, like maybe this is not where you should be in your life,
Yeah,
so
exactly.
these archetypal symbols can be really personal in your own life.
Definitely.
And it doesn't mean that these are autobiographical. Like, this is probably like 1,000 young people working at their day jobs that
Yeah,
millions,
exactly. Who have the same
especially
kind of
artists.
experience, the same
Exactly.
experience, like the feeling of like not being exactly where you're supposed to be. There's
Yeah.
this idea also like that I think we all can feel at times, like the imposter syndrome. We're like, wait, is
Yeah.
this exactly like who I am? But I
Yeah.
think that's part of our journey. I think a lot of times in my own experience, like you have to go, like having that job was crucial for you.
Oh
In the
yeah.
moment you might not know it, but like going through it and looking back, I'm sure you feel that way. It was absolutely crucial for you because it
Mhm.
revealed to you your path.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to go off of the path to see what the path actually is.
Yes.
And
I
I
think
think,
you I don't know. Only in retrospect you can see that you actually have to be pushed to like the point of like complete desperation
mhm,
before you could make a change into something that's scary but maybe
yeah,
the best
breakthrough
path.
moments happen
Yeah.
at when you feel like you're at your weakest
Yeah.
and you're most vulnerable.
Mhm.
Because that's where I think you have this feeling of surrender where you really truly, like in all of your cells of your body, don't know, and you
Yeah.
surrender to not knowing, and that is the doorway to beginning the process of learning,
Yeah.
that we all go through. And I think it's when we kid ourselves, we clown ourselves to believe we know,
Yeah.
is when things really get sort of hairy. You know what I mean? And so always being in that space of humility and openness and this feeling of not knowing, for me, is such a powerful place as an artist to be, because now there's infinite possibilities, because when you're constricting the terrain in some way, because
Mhm.
you have to realize there are things you're never going to be fully aware of, especially in the limitations that we have in this body mind suit
Mhm.
that
I
we
call it
wear.
my my human costume. I put
Yes.
on my human costume when I go out the door because everybody thinks I'm a totally normal person. And it's like, if
Yeah.
I'm good, then
Ex-
everything's fine. They don't know
exactly.
what's going on inside.
Yes, there are, multitudes. Since what's that like saying?
Contain
Like, we contain multitudes,
multitudes. Yeah.
something like that. And it's like, it's
Mhm.
so true. And I think that process really starts to reveal itself when you have a deep connection and authentic relationship to your creativity. I
Mhm.
think that starts to reveal itself in a lot of ways because the creative act in itself is so mysterious. Like we were just
Mhm.
talking about, like, where do these ideas all of a sudden
Where they come
flash
from.
through and come from? Like, is someone just like in another space from above, just like whispering down through the ether? Like, how does this working?
I think it's much more like this idea of like we contain multitudes because we do contain this DNA. It's like we all have the same code essentially, we're
Mm-hmm.
just in different like containers.
Yeah,
So
or expressions. The
uh-huh.
code is being expressing itself differently.
Exactly. Yeah.
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 And
And it made me think of somebody that I started listening to a lot during this period and when I was painting was Ram Dass. Uh,
yeah,
Richard
nice.
Alpert, who is like, he's
Hmm.
hilarious and also like profound. And I can completely relate to him as like a New Yorker, like
Hmm.
growing up like culturally Jewish and then trying to find this really intense other spirituality that resonates
Yeah.
somehow. Um,
Yeah.
but he always said that this life is grist for the mill. You
Yep,
know, I
exactly.
love that saying, and it's like it sounds really kind of like old fashioned, but it's like those little irritants or big irritants, like something that might actually stop like throw a monkey wrench in the machine. Those are the things where you're like, I mean, it might take years to resolve, but and it's super painful, but I think those are the like you can look back and see that those were like the informants, the turning points where like you get a little bit. I think for me, looking at these symbols, it's more like wanting ancestral wisdom because
Hmm.
I've not been able to find in this lifetime from my own parents or maybe a little bit more from friends or even grandparents. Like I want more information. Like I want more, like better, more open truths about
Yes.
like death, life,
Yeah.
why people act the way they are, why societies are the way they are, like what are
Hmm.
weird kind of seemingly arbitrary systems that
Hmm.
are the way we're supposed to live our lives.
I
So
know we made it all up. Like
it
that's
was
what I
all
always
made
like
up.
joke. We made like taxes, insurance,
I
like
mean, the whole
you
economic
know
system, which
we
is
it's
like
made up and we're all
it's
agreeing to play the game, like we're all
right.
buying into it and agreeing to play the game, but we can't forget that at the end of the day, like we can create anything we want here if we have a sense
Yeah.
of agreement, a collective agreement about certain aspects of trade and all that. You need my son's coming in here,
Oh,
Avi. We're
good.
on a podcast right now, you
Hey,
can say hi.
bud.
All right,
Oh my goodness.
you gotta go. That's not appropriate, dude. You know the
He
real.
looks great. I only saw him from
Yeah, he's
the
good.
neck up.
He's good. He's in his jammies. Sorry, y'all. This is
Oh,
life of a parent.
no, I mean, I hope that my kid strolled in here, but we just sent him off on
Yeah. Well, out of 40 some recordings I've done, that's the first time he's ever done that. So maybe that's a special
Hey.
moment. But kids remind us all the time of these
Oh,
things, right? Like
absolutely.
the ephemeral nature of our decision making and like the systems that we live within. Like the kids are
And
like,
like,
we have to
yeah,
teach them these things, and they're like, this makes no sense. And you're like, you're actually right, but this is what we do.
I know. And also, I mean, this is like maybe going a little too far, but it's like this arbitrary moment of conception. It's like,
Hmm.
why this kid?
Hmm.
This kid is in my life now. And like, he fully came out himself. He was not, I thought he
Definitely.
was going to be a certain way, but
Definitely.
he is Noah all the way,
They're bringing, yeah, we are bringing something into this world that wasn't necessarily given to us within this lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
I firmly believe, just looking at my two children and also just reflecting on my own life experiences, I don't know what it is and I can't say definitively anything, but this idea of like reincarnation is very fascinating to me and makes more sense when I think about like just big moral questions around suffering,
Mm-hmm.
and inequity and on, let's say, the planet. Like, how is it, karma and all these things? Like, I think about it
Yeah.
all the time. because I think deep down, most of us, like within our hearts, deep inside, like we can envision a version of this reality that is just utopic, that is perfection, in terms of like the mitigation of unnecessary suffering that we see on a daily basis on this planet, if you're paying attention.
Oh
But
yeah.
to that end, we also see an infinite amount of beauty and love and compassion and just inspiration too. So like we live in this dualistic reality where we have to grapple with the entire spectrum of human experience. And I think
Yeah.
as artists, like we have to find a way to filter the truth of that while at the same time looking what is beyond that system. It's like almost like the dualistic framework is a container, for, that is contained by something bigger. It's like inside of something else. I think of almost like the Russian dolls. It's like there's this inside of that, inside of this, inside of that, this sort of like nesting
Hmm.
of experience that's
Yeah.
happening. And so,
I mean, I have been thinking about that lately in my paintings. Like I've been doing a lot of these parallel universe paintings, kind of like,
mhm,
you know, I have this one painting that's called Parallels, and it's kind of like these three bodies that are all just kind of stacked. And
mm,
I definitely am like, I guess my perspective now is mostly Buddhist. So
mhm,
reincarnation is I mean, it's something that I can't not believe in, not just because of Buddhism, but just because of what I feel, even like in a like scientifically, like we are part of this. It's material and it's energy. So,
yeah, exactly.
um,
And energy is never destroyed,
right.
right? It's
I
only
mean,
recycled and changed.
yeah, maybe. I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
I listen to a lot, what I really love, this like dualistic kind of idea of being in your human costume and then
Hmm.
also knowing that there's this bigger reality is I was listening to a podcast with Brian Greene, who's
Oh
a
no, yeah.
physicist.
Oh,
He
cool.
wrote oh, what was his big book? Well, he's a physicist. He teaches at Columbia, and he's kind
Okay.
of like a Carl Sagan of
Mm,
quantum physics, right? He did like
cool.
a TV show about like quantum physics and the weirdness of that.
Yeah.
But he was
Spooky
saying,
action at a
yeah,
distance.
yeah, exactly. Like passing through, it's like super cheesy, his show where
Yeah.
he's like passing through walls. He's kind of like doing the magician act, but trying to
Yeah.
quantum physics. But anyway, with the interviewer, he was saying like his worldview is that he believes that with the Big Bang and with all of these kind of the physics that were put into place at the origin of our universe or
Hmm.
the whole universe, whatever it is, that everything was determined. So there's not actually any free will. Like we go about our lives thinking that we have free will,
Mm-hmm.
but physics says that it's all we're all just these vectors of particles that have already been put into place, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
So the interviewer, and now I'm remembering, it was like Krista Tippett on NPR, her like
Okay.
NPR show, was like, well, how do you go to you still have your job, like you have your family, you go about doing these things. And he's like, I know, like I have to go about pretending that I'm making these decisions
Hmm.
and go through the motions, but he truly believes that
Yeah.
all of this has been, put into motion for him. And it's
Yeah.
not all in a religious way. Like
Yeah.
he's anti like putting a religious or even spiritual stamp on this. It's more like I'm going by these like the mathematics of,
Yeah, it's
of
super fascinating. It makes me think of this aspect in Buddhist philosophy called dependent co-arising, and how
absolutely.
everything is interdependently related on everything else. And so nothing is ultimately separate, or like the doctrines of emptiness or shunyata, which is like related to this idea that like what is actually like there is a field of infinite possibility that is unmanifest, and
Yes.
that reality becomes manifest through a sequence of cause and effect.
Mm-hmm.
And so but there is still within Buddhist cosmological principles and philosophical principles, to focus on that at least, there
Mm-hmm.
is a sort of interesting debate around free will versus like this idea of determinism. I think the jury's still out in my life on that. I think that there's probably a degree of both happening at varying levels of consciousness. So it
Hmm.
all depends on like what level of consciousness we're speaking to. So like thinking about like, thinking about subjective versus objective or absolute versus relative truth, right? And
Right.
so we think about those components of reality, like there's this feeling of relative truth, the truth that like if I hold a pen and I drop it, it's going to fall, right? But then there's this absolute truth where it's there was never a pen in the first place. You know what I mean? And so it's like, how do you grapple with both of these things at once? I
Yeah.
think that is really for me what the human experience is kind of about,
Yeah.
is like, how do we walk the line between these two sort of seemingly competing ideas? For me, that I feel like they're in some way completely like what's the word I'm looking for? I feel like they're completely like in harmony with each other,
Yes.
but
Yeah. I
it's
mean,
mysterious. I'm not sure.
yeah. I mean, these are the questions that I love and have always loved to think about since I was little. Um, and it makes me weirdly feel better about the world we live in because this
Hmm.
world is like, if I read the news like 2 times a day, which I don't anymore, I can't even start to get into the weeds with like how much suffering there is in the world.
Hmm.
But what I've always felt comfort in is this the mystery, that humans maybe, and like Carl Sagan said this, like maybe we're the way that the universe can know itself. Like we
Hmm.
are of the universe, but we're its own way of kind of trying to ask these bigger questions that
Hmm.
I don't think with our, with the brains we have, it's like trying to load like, like my all of my information on my laptop now into a Mac from 1995.
Exactly. The
Not,
hardware is not there.
yeah, you can't fully compute. But
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
just love that we're asking that, like we're starting to try to
Hmm.
ask those questions of like what is beyond this, like the
Yeah.
our reality that we could comprehend through the language that we have. Um,
I think
but
that's what's
also,
beautiful about being an artist, though, Emily.
yeah,
It's like that's what's amazing about like what you're doing and what so many artists out there that I've, had the, pleasure of interviewing and connecting with and people that I see, the work that I do. It's like there is a movement of artists that are now like unapologetically looking into spirituality, looking
yeah,
into toward the mystery in a more like, I think artists are
yeah,
always doing this on some level, but in a more like we're like owning it and like, unapologetically doing it,
yeah.
because for so long it was
It was
kind
a
of
dirty word.
taboo. Yeah.
Oh
At
yeah,
least
and like
in Western
even
art.
yeah, and even in Carl Jung for a while was like, we don't really touch that because he's a
Hmm.
little too out there, a little like too woo woo. But I do think that it's like there's a pendulum swing, like
Hmm.
there was like it was religion and then it was the enlightenment and then we were back to like but science at this point and like which is like holy my religion is probably half scientific half Buddhist and I remember you said about like these harmonies like they in my head really go well together. I don't think there
Definitely.
should be a separation between those
Definitely.
if you're
Yeah, I
especially
mean, Buddhism, in some
yeah,
people's perspective, is a science of consciousness. It's this,
absolutely,
it's like
there's
it's a
questioning, yeah,
it's crucial, and even in Judaism, right? Like I think of Judaism like one of the most incredible parts of I think the Jewish tradition from a religious perspective is this idea of constantly questioning and challenging God, challenging like challenging the cosmology, and really having this degree of skepticism
yes.
as a way to further develop greater connection and faith with the divine. And I think that is so important to have that. I think surrender is also really important too, and there's like a balance there,
Mm-hmm.
between like being fully surrendering to the cosmological origin or creator or universal principle of reality, whatever we want. These are just words, right? They're not the thing itself, like whatever we want to call it. But at the same time, we also have to be in dialogue in a space where we can continue to evolve and grow our consciousness to fully understand, quote unquote, God, or really, like you were saying, like the universe knowing itself,
Mm-hmm.
right, in a full and complete way. And I think that is illustrating a lot of what the spiritual journey is about,
Yeah,
you
that's kind
know?
of like a Russian doll, like the
Mm-hmm.
Buddhist meditator to
Yeah.
the Buddha.
Yep.
the universe knowing itself, you know.
Yes.
I like these metaphors of like,
Me
you know,
too.
nested geometry is like, I think that's why those things come up a lot in
Yeah.
my work and probably yours too. Like the repetition.
Hmm.
You know, I like to think about like, you know, fractals or like, you know, Mandelbrot, like, you know, these
Yeah.
systems within a system,
Hmm.
because I think, I mean, that's what we are as people, right? We're these little
Hmm.
containers that are like, we're not
Yeah.
actually that separate, you know, we're
Not at
actually
all. Actually,
talking
I
to each
don't think
other.
not there's not even it's that is the ultimate illusion,
Hmm.
is the illusion of separateness.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think the fractal geometry is so fascinating. It makes me think of like, the relationship between macro and microcosmic reality, and how we think like the Nautilus, right? Like looking over your shoulder,
Mhm.
and the mirroring of that geometric process in the way that the galaxy looks, the way that a conch shell looks, the
Mhm.
way that we think of Fibonacci and sort of divine proportion rolls out. Like we're seeing it in the grandest, most epic scale, and we're seeing it at the most infinitesimally small scale, and
Yeah.
every step in between. So
Yeah.
it is like it to me. That's why I think it's these symbols that you're using. They're so universal because of the way they traverse scale, not
Hmm.
only physical scale, but scale of even like consciousness itself,
Hmm.
degrees of consciousness. So I think that's why when we see them, it's almost in an unconscious way, it's reminding us who we are,
Hmm.
where we actually come from, and where we actually live.
Yeah.
Like this is a temporary
Yep.
experience within an infinite reality.
Yeah.
And I think that is where a lot of suffering comes from, is the attachment to the temporary experience
Yeah.
and the lack of recognition of the infinite reality beyond it. And I think that's what art has the power to do, is to transport us or connect us to a little morsel of what that is or
Hmm.
means, even if we don't fully understand it when we look at it, but we have this feeling. You probably felt this a lot when you've seen certain artwork in your life, where it's just like arresting. It stops you in your tracks, and it's speaking to something you can't quite put your finger on, and you can't quite express why it is that you're drawn to this image or this work of art, but you can't help but
Yes.
be drawn into it. And there's something happening there. That's why I feel like I am an artist, is because I want to dive deep into these spaces and create these experiences, not only for myself, but for anybody else who's willing to entertain what I do,
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
I also am like, there's part of it that, like, you know, I've always had a kind of weird relationship with like inclusivity and exclusivity and belonging, and for me, art was always this way of feeling like I'm in a space that I belong.
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, not like you know, I never felt like I belonged in an art world or even like accepted anywhere, but just like with myself, with my paintbrush or my, you know, when I'm
Yeah.
drawing. But I think it's so, for me, it makes me really happy when there are people in my life who don't maybe have an art background and have always felt excluded, that can have um, a relationship or like a reaction to an artwork where they feel like they belong and they can own their opinion of that artwork, you know.
Yes. Yes. I think that's where a lot of postmodern art kind of like really created more exclusivity within art, like where people you go to, I'm thinking about like more conceptual art, from like the 80s or even the
Mm-hmm.
90s, like, and like how it really kind of created more exclusivity, like, and
Yeah.
makes people feel stupid, like when I go to certain museums or galleries with family or friends, and there's some really like odd, challenging artwork, like even thinking of like Jeff Koons or Saul Lewitt, who I love Saul Lewitt.
Yeah,
Jeff Koons,
amazing.
not so much, but Saul Lewitt, or like, Carl Andre, or thinking about like even Donald Judd, like people going like, what the fuck is this? Like this,
Yeah.
and they feel stupid, or they feel like they're not in the know. And like and that to me is, I understand the value of like what
Yeah.
postmodern artists were trying to like push the boundaries of, but I think that it all kind of work to the detriment of the inclusivity of
Mhm.
the art experience for larger audiences. And I think what you're doing, what a lot of artists I see doing that are creating art in a way that you don't need to have an answer. There doesn't need to be a reason that you need to fully comprehend. It can be just immediate, instantaneous. Like you see it, you're drawn to it, and that's enough.
Mhm.
You know, you don't have
Mhm.
to hyper intellectualize the work.
Yes.
And I think we need that in a lot of ways.
Yes, we do. I think we
Mhm.
need it all. I think it's
Yes.
kind of like a religion or any system of belief because art really is. It's taken me a while to come to this, but I really think it is kind of its own religion. When we think about this art world that we
Hmm.
have, it's like
Hmm.
the hierarchies and the systems, and it is like the suspended disbelief that as artists we all walk into it and we're like, of course, of
Yeah.
course, like a Donald Judge should be at the Dia Beacon and be worth this amount of money, and like yes, because it has this value that goes back.
Hmm.
It's like the belief systems that we hold.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, definitely. But I
then
think we need a new paradigm though. And I
yeah,
think that's what's emerging.
yeah, maybe it's art for humanity can use this like really,
Hmm.
because what are we doing it for if it's just for like a one-upmanship or a market
Exactly.
value kind of thing.
Or trying to be like super clever,
Yeah,
like how
yeah,
clever can you be? And I'm like, I don't
yeah,
know if art's necessarily always about being clever. For
yeah,
me, and this is my own, it's about authenticity.
yes,
It's about really stripping away the boundaries as much as you can, and being vulnerable and trying to find an authentic expression of your own grappling with your human experience.
hmm,
And that can look similar in some artists. When you look at some artists, it can look very similar and it can look very different from other artists. But I think if you're doing that, you're doing something special and important.
yeah,
It's when you're trying to create art from a perspective of commerce or
oh yeah,
notoriety, or from a perspective of like um trying to be seen or known. It
yeah,
can get a little slippery and tricky,
yeah,
in terms of the quality of the art itself, because at the end of the day all this stuff dissolves anyway.
does,
you know
yeah. I mean, I think there is a little bit, as a younger artist, you need to be seen at some point, otherwise you
hmm.
will never,
Hmm.
you won't keep going, or it's just too depressing.
Yeah, no,
Um,
definitely. Yeah, I
so I
agree. There's
think,
a balance there, but I think
yeah,
it's
we're at some point you're trying to do, I don't know. I had this experience where I had a day job for so long that nobody was looking at me. So I was just making the work that I wanted to make and kind of pulling from whoever was influencing me. And I didn't have a signature style.
hmm.
But there's a weird thing then with ego and then the like pure creativity. You're just like following that voice.
Yeah.
You draw the line where, and I think it's the line is like, you have to be pretty uncomfortable to put
Hmm.
something out there to move your work to the next. Like you got to do the clown painting.
Yeah.
When the voice tells you to make the clown painting, like maybe
You
you have to
should.
do it. Yeah. And maybe you also need to put it out there, like on the wall of a gallery.
Definitely. And I think
Sure.
there's a balance to be had. I think it's really important that you find your methods and avenues to be able to share your work. There are certain artists that are just going to be the hermit types that will hide away, like Hilma, right? Like her work never seen, you
I mean, but
know,
she also had the money to be and the situation to be able to do that.
it's a different
But
time period. It was a different
yeah,
time period too.
yeah,
For
nobody
me, I
wanted.
think the goal that I have is sustainability.
Yeah.
It's the ability to continue to grow and develop your work and feel like you can sustain your life, your surroundings, your children, you know what
Mhm.
I mean? Like, find a way to survive in these, like we talked about, made up systems, so that you can ultimately continue to grow your work and develop,
Yes. I
know?
mean, this might be going into like heavy territory, but like I'm in my 40s now, and it's this time in my life where people I know have started to die, and people
Hmm.
my age, from like addiction or disease or whatever, like accidents. But
Yeah.
I'm starting to think, like I want my time, and I hope I live a couple more decades so I can keep
Yeah.
doing this.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
that the preciousness of like the life of an artist is it's so much better. It's so much more than, finance. I don't need
Definitely.
to ever have a lot of money. I just want to be able to do this. And
Exactly.
in this life,
Exactly.
you know?
And I think there's room for all of us, and that's what's so important to me too. And that's what drives this project is to create that sense of community and connection and support and camaraderie, like to really cheer each other on to
Yeah.
make this work. Because I think what we're all doing in our own way is planting seeds of awakening and seeds of of the mystery revealing itself so people might be able to have a little bit of a wider perspective on their own life,
Yeah.
to realize that this is an ephemeral experience and that certain things aren't as big of a deal as we think they are, and
Mm-hmm.
that there's bigger things happening,
Mm-hmm.
and if we can connect with that like wider and wider spans of reality, like to me that gives me a lot of peace, you know is this feeling that like I am connected to something much greater than my individuated self, and I'm a part of this story of reality, and I'm playing my role, the role, we're all playing these different roles in our life.
Oh yeah.
And but I struggle with it, but it's something I'm always trying to like paying attention to is the attachment. Like, where am I so attached to this role that I'm playing or this experience I'm having, where it's actually pulling me out of a space
Yeah.
of open-hearted compassion and love?
Yeah.
As cheesy as that might
No,
sound,
but that
to
is
me,
like
that is what it's all about,
and
you
I
know?
think for the artist, like that's the most important journey because it's like, I mean, there's nothing but ego in this field. It's like, look at me, look what I made. My name is on
Mm-hmm.
this. And it's so like the
Mm-hmm.
authenticity is the individual.
Yeah.
You're making work about, dependent origination, you have to, how do you reconcile those things? So,
Yeah,
you know, with,
exactly.
and then, having a kid is like a whole different idea. How can you want to be detached from this world when you have a human that you're responsible for that you love more than anything.
Exactly.
Um,
Yeah, that
but
is a big struggle. And it's a very important lesson I think we learn as parents is the ability to like fully like surrender our own self for the sake of another.
mhm.
And like I try to talk about this sometimes, especially with some of my friends who don't have kids, and just trying to explain like every decision that goes through my mind is filtered through them,
Mm,
the awareness of them in some way, like they are a part of every equation of any decision I seem to make or most decisions that I make, whereas before them it was not so much, like I had a little bit, you know what I mean, but like
yeah,
everything
yeah.
is filtered through their needs and
Hmm.
making sure that I can meet their needs. And it's
Yeah,
been an amazing journey. It's so
yeah,
special for me
yeah,
because it's just they're my teachers,
yeah.
my children are that's my guru you just met, right there. That's my guru right there.
That's such a good way to think about it. But
You
oh my
know,
gosh, when you're in the thick of it with those
it's
kids,
hard to
it's
remember. I
hard to
know.
it's grist for the mill.
It
Um,
is total grist for the mill.
yeah, I mean, but my husband and I used to. I mean, we were kind of joking, but not really. Like, we have one kid, and that's all we have in us.
Yeah, for sure.
Say it's like a magical journey is not it doesn't it doesn't give credit to like how painful and like debilitating the process is of like starting a life as a parent versus
Mhm.
being having your extended adolescence.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
But
It's
we're like we called it like we went through a spiritual death
mm-hmm.
before we like the first couple, I would say, years of being parents was like I really gave up on the dream of whatever
Mm-hmm.
that was before, whoever I was. That, you know, I was like always thinking of it, and it's like, again, archetypal, totally
Yeah.
cliche, but really true. Like this metamorphosis of like a
Mm-hmm.
moth or a butterfly is like, it was like this chrysalis moment where
Yeah.
I was complete goo. I was like
Mm-hmm.
scrambled. I was a version of myself, but I was like, if you, but inside that cocoon, I was like just muck. And then
Yeah.
you come out as something else, and it's not a very, for me, it was not an easy process,
Mm-hmm.
but I can say in retrospect, it was a good process. And
Yeah.
yes, my kid was like, is my guru. He is the reason like I am where I am physically and like mentally in this life.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, I can relate to it, and I can, and honestly, I can only relate to it to a certain degree because I'm a man. I didn't birth a
Yeah.
child.
Yeah.
I didn't have a child living inside of me. Like, so I have a very limited perspective in that regard. But I've, just observing my own wife and observing the development of my children, there are many challenging components, but and it will continue to do so, but it's been really special. And I
Yeah.
think, it comes, everything kind of goes and ebbs and flows. You probably have like super like high productive moments and months or weeks, and then
Yeah.
you're like, what? Like, I haven't really been painting in the past, few weeks, and it's been really hard, but like, because there are just other things in my life I have to be addressing right now.
Oh, yeah.
And sometimes you got to be able to like put things aside. But
Hmm.
at the end of the day, it's like I look at this as a life path. And I'm sure
Hmm.
you feel the same way, regardless of whatever success or failure. It's a path of life. Like, this is a role that you're going to play in this reality that's going to help you grow your consciousness in the way that it needs to grow. But it's hard and it's challenging. But at the end of the day, I think what you're doing is super special and amazing. And I think before we like wrap up today, I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about like some, specifics in
Yeah.
relations to your work, because there's some questions I have around like, not only like you kind of addressed like some of like your process, you know what I mean, in
Hmm.
terms of how you began like with the gradients and like really like letting sort of like your intuition guide you. I'm curious about the frame choices too. You make these beautiful custom frames for I
Yes.
think most or not all of your pieces. And are they handmade by you, like out of ceramic material
Yes.
generally, or wood?
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Tell me
Well,
about
so
that and that
yeah.
choice.
Well, that was part of, that idea of like the container or like the space of suspended disbelief. Um, I think that's how I was originally starting to think about them in like 2015 or so. So after graduate school, I I must have been like spending time, I spent a lot of time at museums, and I was noticing that like kind of these modernist artists like Mondrian made his own frames, and they were
Mm-hmm.
really important to the paintings.
Yeah.
And at the time, I was also thinking about like hierarchies of high and low. Again, like this idea of inclusion, exclusion. What
Yeah.
is painting with a capital P, and what are those
Mm-hmm.
subjects, like history painting being pretty high up, and like, I don't know, like, you know, still life painting being lower.
Yeah.
Um, and I was thinking about materials too, like what's design versus what's high art. And
Mm-hmm.
with the frames, I kind of wanted to integrate those two, where the
Yeah.
design element was as integral to the artwork as the oil on linen, which is like,
Mm-hmm.
precious.
Yeah.
So that was the beginning. And I was working at the School of Visual Arts in New York. So I had the wood shop, and I was making panels and frames, and I would treat the frames the same way. Like I would gesso them and paint them in oil with layers. And then I had a time when I was doing a group show with some other artists, and one of the artists was a sculptor who worked with glass.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to do something that was a little more tactile. So I started making them from ceramics.
Cool.
And ceramics was like just going a little bit further with this idea of high and low. Like ceramics was kind of beginning to have a little renaissance, but not quite.
Definitely. Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think like at that time I was kind of lucky where it was like, oh, well, I'm working in ceramics and people are taking that seriously too, but integrated with the painting that was
Yeah.
still so, valuable market wise and
Mm-hmm.
historically valued. And I really liked that, like, it was like painting with these ceramics, like it's plastic, so you can
Mm-hmm.
change it, you can be a little bit more spontaneous with the forms, even though the process is very rigid.
Mm-hmm.
It's like has its own little,
Yeah,
you
it's
know,
delicate.
brain of its own. Yeah. And
Mm-hmm.
and you have to work with it in a certain way so that it doesn't like go haywire in the kiln.
Yeah.
You can sculpt it, and so that's kind of where those came from. And now, like, at this point, it's really intuitive, like the
Yeah.
frames and how the frames go with the paintings. It's just another one of those ways of talking about relativity, in relationships.
Yeah. I love how organic they are. I love like the organic feel of them, like
Yeah.
even just like the wavy edges on some of
Mhm.
them, or some of the glazes that you do on them, and how you match them with,
Mhm.
certain colors, or like kind of complement certain colors, within the color palette of a painting. Like I just think for me, like when I first noticed that you were doing that, I was like, it was such an incredible surprise. And I was like, this is
Thank
brilliant.
you.
Like this is just,
Oh my
it
gosh.
just really just I think it really kind of brings the object of the painting out
Yeah.
of just a two-dimensional thing and really shows like that this is an actual object and not
An
just like a
object.
surface
Yeah.
to look at, but like it's
Yeah.
more than that. Like even though it's like subtle, it's just a frame, but it's a handmade frame. It's using an unconventional material for a frame.
Hmm.
So I just was really interested in sort of like how that came. And I think that makes sense, like this bridging of like high and low, the utilitarian sort of associations that usually come with ceramics, like pottery and things like that,
Hmm.
like objects that we actually use for plants or vessels and things like that. So I'm excited to see you continue to kind
Yeah.
of push that, because I
Yeah.
think there's like really, I mean, you're just scratching the surface
Yeah.
of what's possible in terms of bridging like the oil painting with the
And the ceramic.
ceramic,
Hmm. Yeah.
component as well. So I think for me that's super exciting, and I think it's just kind of scratching the surface of what they could ultimately turn into as you get more and more
Yeah.
comfortable with the
With ceramics.
medium.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. I mean, I think that's why it was so fun in the beginning because for me it was very low stakes, because it was
Mm-hmm.
new for me. I'm like, I'm an amateur at this. This is just something that I can kind of really let go and make it like a
Yeah.
craft element. Whereas the paintings have this kind of preciousness or
Mm-hmm.
sacredness. But yeah, I'm working on a show with Koenig Gallery that's in Mexico City that opens at the
Awesome.
end of the summer. So
Wow.
it's all going to
Awesome.
be smaller works, and I have this kind of slab roller now, like a table in my studio. So I'm like, all of these paintings that I just like, new canvases are small, and I think that's like where I'm really gonna focus.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I'm super excited to see the work continue to evolve. I mean, I love so much of the imagery, like even bringing like the Greek vessels in there, like thinking about antiquity, thinking about the stories or the symbols that like were utilized within that era of time and how they're very related to some of the same things we're dealing with in
Absolutely.
our culture,
I mean, it's
but
all
also
just like love, sex, death, war.
exactly. I think we've been
Really not
grappling
that
this
different.
forever. I feel like humans back then are not that much different than us now in terms of like those basic elements. Of course, our society looks different. Of course, some of our standards are different in terms of morality or living standards or what have you.
Yeah.
But I think that, the human species itself is on this evolutionary trajectory, and we can't negate our history. We have to really look into sort of where we've come from to get a sense of like how we're evolving, so that maybe we can envision a new sort of like trajectory that we might be able to
Oh
take
yeah.
as our society continues to go
Hmm.
through this mass transformation that we see it going through. I also love in your work the hands, the way that hands are
Yeah.
so, I mean, it to me, that is like what differentiates. I mean, to even to any biologist or anyone who studies like the evolution of species, like the opposable thumb, like the hand itself is really like symbolic of like this step in evolution toward our ability to create the world we live in. But I also think of like the gestures that you see in Renaissance painting, the gestures you see in even like all sorts of painting of deities within Eastern
Mudras. Yeah.
traditions. Yeah, you know what
Hmm.
I mean, the mudras, exactly. So I think that there's like so many amazing ways that you're bringing geometry and sort of like non-objective forms with
Hmm.
like representational images, and you're really like bridging all of these things into one plane. So it's really exciting, Emily, in terms of like the path that you're on, and you have a
Thank,
big fan here
thank
with the
you.
work you're
Same.
doing, and I'm super grateful that we're spending this time together. It's been about an hour,
Okay,
and I
great.
feel like we can, there are definitely some rabbit holes that we could definitely come back to maybe in the
Yes.
future. We want to dive deeper, especially into like the archetypes and things like that. But within an hour-ish, we can only go so far and deep. But I feel like we traversed a pretty vast terrain today.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just want to thank you for your time and being on the podcast. And everybody out there who's listening, check the show notes. Make sure you follow Emily on Instagram, check the website. You got a number of shows that are coming up, so we can
Yes.
definitely highlight that and point people to that. But just want to thank you again, and keep it up, keep it going.
Oh my gosh, same to you. Thank you for having me. This has just like been a delight, and I think it's going to be really helpful, with moving forward with painting and letting the synchronicities happen.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, they're happening all the time. It's just,
I
are
mean,
you aware of them?
yeah,
And
looking
it's
out for them.
always, yeah, they're always there. Yeah, it's sometimes I think synchronicities, like, think of like deja vu and synchronicities. For me, it's like at the very least, they're pointing to this notion of like you're in the right place at the right
You're,
time, doing the
yeah,
right thing. Like it's like the universe like winking at you, like you're doing
keep
just
going.
fine. And in another sense, I feel like sometimes, especially like deja vu or like moments where like weird things come together in a way that just seems so like
Yeah.
nonsensical.
Mm-hmm.
It's like
Non sequitur.
it's almost like, pointing to like a past experience that is rehashing itself, like a time and a place where you've experienced something like this before that might not be in this particular lifetime. But who knows? We'll continue to
Yeah,
unravel this
chapter
mystery,
two.
y'all.
We'll start with the
um,
deja vus.
exactly. But there's, I think the point of today, y'all, anyone listening, is there's way more that we don't know than we do know. So
Yeah.
strive on and keep searching. So
Yeah.
awesome,
Following
Emily.
the spiral path.
Always. All right. Well, you take care, Emily. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Awesome. Peace. Thank you all so much for tuning into this episode of Concerning the Spiritual and Art. If you like what we're doing here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you can stay in touch and in tune with all the amazing offerings that we're going to be bringing to this channel. Thanks again for all your support. Super grateful, and excited to bring more content your way. Peace, y'all.